Time loops and Groundhog Days scenarios are nothing new to fiction, especially within the realm of video games. It's a concept that's rife with storytelling and gameplay potential, so it's hardly surprising to see the concept explored so thoroughly. Haven't we all wondered what we would do if we had the ability to alter our mistakes, to change an outcome that we once couldn't foresee? But equally, the idea of being trapped in that loop, with no foreseeable way out, it's horrifying. How would one cope with living in a world that repeats itself? No matter what changes you make, would you lose your mind? Or would you push forward no matter what? In Stars in Time, an RPG from developer Insert Disc 5, we're put in the shoes of Sifrin, an adventurer who is set to save the world from an evil king, along with their party of lively companions. Unfortunately, poor Sifrin ends up dying moments after entering the king's castle, but then wakes up before entering the castle, and their allies seem to be completely unaware of anything unusual. After encountering a mysterious star-faced stranger named Loop, Sifrin decides to use this time loop to his advantage to help their party get through the castle's tricks and traps unscathed. What makes the game's story somewhat unique is that you are essentially playing the final portion of an epic adventure. You and your companions start at level 45, and you already have plenty of skills at your disposal. The game still takes the time to teach you the basics, but it's framed in a way that makes sense for the narrative. Despite the game focusing on the end of Sifrin's journey, it doesn't take long for the story to become engaging. Each of the other members of Sifrin's quintet is written in a way that makes them immediately likable and easy to root for. While they definitely fit certain roles you'd expect from an RPG party, they each have their own surprising character traits, and the camaraderie is so incredibly wholesome, heartwarming, and at times exceptionally poignant. It's easy to pick a favorite right from the start, but by the end of the adventure, you'll be emotionally attached to all of them. This is only bolstered by the design work and portraits, which are wonderfully charming. The simplistic cartoon style really lets the emotions of these characters shine. The entire game is presented in monochrome, which is pretty striking in and of itself, and leads to the world of Vagarde leaving a big impression on the player. Focusing on two main environments, the town of Dormont and the King's Castle, you very quickly become familiar with the world and all of its details. The visual style might be too simplistic for some, but to me it just makes the game all the more appealing to look at. I have to commend the soundtrack as well, as it is beautifully done and complements the distinct graphical style. Equally straightforward is the gameplay, which sees you seeing from a top-down perspective like in many other RPGs. While controlling Sifrin, you solve puzzles around the castle, fight creatures with your party, and steadily progress up the castle's peak, all while factoring in your new ability to time loop. Spicing up battles a bit is the inclusion of a rock-paper-scissors weakness triangle, and a good deal of thought has to be done to fight efficiently, as the large variety of enemies have their own gimmicks to consider. By looking at the hands of the enemies, you can usually tell what sort of attacks will be more effective against it, but it's not always immediately obvious, so each new encounter will keep you on your toes. The game's new time loop mechanics play into these battles too. Sifrin retains all of his abilities and XP after reset, but his party doesn't. So while he will eventually be more stronger, you have to balance that with however strong your companions are at the portion of the game you have to be looped to. Your team still keeps their equipment at least, and the equipable memories allow them to retain individual abilities no matter what level they are. Eventually, battles can become a little trivialized by not only Sifrin's power, but also by some of the better equipment you can find. But I never found myself getting particularly bored of the combat. The time loops play into both exploration and puzzle solving as well, since consumable items can also be lost during each loop. So you have to become familiar with where consumables are if you want to stay stocked up and ready for anything. Keys, of course, also return to their original locations upon resets, and although you can loop to a point where all the doors on the floor are unlocked, that comes at a cost, and some locations will be locked off to you anyway as a result of your decisions. You have to loop, and you have to loop a lot. The game will roadblock you at points, or you'll be faced with a choice that will require you to reset if you make the wrong choice. Can this be frustrating? Sometimes, but it never feels like it inconveniences the player too much since the spots you can return to are very evenly spaced out. It really feels like a great deal of consideration has gone into making the looping mechanic a vital part of the experience. There are a lot of moving parts with both the gameplay and the story, and it's great to see it all come together as nicely as this. There's a great deal of memory work involved when it comes to objectives, especially in the late game sections. The game will have you running around backtracking to find a specific book, object, or location that will help you push forward. You'll usually be pushed in the right direction at least, and it doesn't get complicated to the point where it becomes obtuse or obnoxious. Your guide loop is usually on hand for most of the game to help you out, and the game map is compact enough so that nothing is ever really confusing. There's probably only one objective in the game that had me scratching my head a little more than usual, and it was purely just down to my own memory failing me. Before I continue, I want to elaborate that although what I'm about to say is likely to come off as a negative, I think overall what it does for the narrative experience is a huge positive and should be commended. As you progress through the story, the objectives become more and more fatiguing as you constantly backtrack through the castle, through time, and through conversations you've seen before, as they've all repeated themselves again and again. The repetition started to become draining once I was about 15 hours in, and I was eager to feel like I was making some sort of progress. But then I realized I still did not want to put this game down. And Stars in Time is so compelling because it really makes you connect with the protagonist, and it turns what should be a negative into something that drives you to want to see the game to its conclusion. I felt a very real empathy with Siffrin because of this. Eventually, the loop does start to take a toll on them. They get more and more desperate, more and more impatient, and more exhausted, but still, they keep pushing forward to find a way to move on. The repetition of the gameplay is bonded to the repetition of the narrative, and somehow creates something uniquely brilliant and spellbinding. It leads to some amazing and emotionally powerful moments both before and during the conclusion, and the catharsis you feel is just so satisfying because you truly empathize with what Siffrin has been through. Sticking with the game is truly worth it for moments like that, and it made me happy to push through. It only makes me consider if this repetition was intentional or not. Perhaps I'm just being hyperbolic, but it feels like it was baked right into the experience. The emotional harmony it has is right there, and it's just so transfixing. Whether it was part of the plan or not, it just made In Stars in Time that much more of an emotional roller coaster for me, and that's the kind of experience that I live for. For some, the repetition of In Stars in Time might not resonate in the same way as it did for me, and I completely understand that. I feel as if the latter half of the game will lose some people, but regardless, I say it's worth having some patience for this one. From the charming characters, the excellent execution of the time loop story, and the lovingly crafted visuals. In Stars in Time is a unique experience I never want to forget, and I do believe it to be an indie masterpiece. Noisy Pixel is giving In Stars in Time a 10 out of 10. Thanks for watching. This video is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers providing independent gaming coverage through news, reviews, previews, and more. Check out our Patreon to help support our continued growth, and subscribe to keep up with all our future content.
Noisy Pixel.